Would we use perception to help shroud what we're trying to protect? Absolutely. If you've got an aerial platform that is highly advanced and the public who happens to get a glimpse of the thing, if they're convinced that it's from Venus and there's no way it could be our military, well, hey, you know, that's awesome. Hell yes.
It was very easy to convince Paul. Paul was a World War II veteran. He's very patriotic. He always flew his flag. Those type of people you can convince that, listen, you can't tell anybody else about this because this, you know, you get in the wrong hands.
Whatever's going on, it's happening at a government level. Everything that I do is being watched. And I have to assume that I'm being bugged.
Let's take one step at a time. You're looking at Richard Doty, the professional disinformer, trained to lie.
Performing posthumous prolapses on prosperous persons. Alright, great. Alright, just so you know, a little bit of like a cold or something, so my voice is a little weird, and I didn't plan on doing this video at all. I'm actually halfway through a Jeremy DeWitt serial police impersonator video, but after getting this video right here in my notifications almost every day for the last few months, I finally decided to see what it was all about, and boy, all I can say is, YouTube, I'll never doubt your algorithm ever again. You know me better than I know myself. Due to the corny little thumbnail, I just assumed it would be another crackpot video where someone talks about fifth dimensional time-leaping Sasquatch building the pyramids, or details their weird extraterrestrial erotica. Seriously though, I mean, why is almost every alien abduction story sexual? They almost always turn sexual, it's weird. Go look it up. Guess they gotta make them hybrids, I don't know. Whatever. So you've probably heard the timeless phrase, never judge a book by its cover. I'd like to propose an addendum. Never judge a book by its cover, and never judge a YouTube video by its thumbnail. Because I couldn't have been more wrong about what this video would be. The film Mirage Men is a documentary that follows the story of the late Paul Bennewitz and the Disinformation Campaign he was subjected to by the NSA and other various government agencies, including the U.S. Air Force. This happened after he used a radio, satellite, and his computer to intercept various coded communications that were coming to and from a nearby Air Force base. It was also discovered that he had taken pictures of top-secret experimental aircraft that were being tested by the Air Force. Paul was an avid UFO enthusiast and perhaps already showing some signs of mental illness. He was known to be a pretty paranoid guy by friends and family. He believed that the transmissions he was intercepting were coded alien messages. He believed that he had deciphered these codes and that he had subsequently uncovered a plot by aliens to take over the world and to use human beings as slaves and steal our water. As a World War II veteran and self-described patriot, he began fearing a threat to national security. He actually contacted Kirkland Air Force Base to alert them of the threat. Upon realizing that the messages he was intercepting were actually transmissions coming from the base, the Air Force were unsure of what to do about the situation. Kind of between a rock and a hard place there. On one hand, they have a civilian intercepting, you know, highly sensitive and classified documents from an Air Force base. On the other hand, this civilian thinks that it's aliens. This gave them an idea, and they realized they had sort of an opportunity with this. They realized that they could use Paul's fascination with UFOs as a way to both prevent him from realizing what he'd actually stumbled upon, while also creating a disinformation campaign in the UFO community. Various government organizations were interested in this because the UFO community had started to become a kind of a pesky problem. They were constantly stumbling onto classified documents and taking pictures of aircraft, thinking that they had, you know, snapped a picture of a UFO. To kickstart this campaign, the Air Force then dispatched a special agent named Richard Doty to find out the extent of what Paul knew. He discovered that Paul was tapping into communications and was also in possession of photographs he had taken near his home of what were at the time top-secret experimental aircraft. He believed these aircraft to be UFOs, however. Now, I want you to imagine something. Imagine you're already a firm believer in UFOs. Great. Now imagine you think you've discovered a secret plot by extraterrestrials to take over the world and steal the water and enslave humanity. Great. Now imagine that someone from the U.S. Air Force, a special agent nonetheless, has shown up at your house and starts to tell you that all of your suspicions about UFOs and ETs are all correct. Now, even one more level. I want you to imagine that this Air Force special agent starts taking you out on recon and surveillance missions in Air Force helicopters as a way to gather evidence and information for the coming attack. If all of this happened to you, do you really honestly think that anyone would ever be able to convince you that aliens weren't real or that UFOs weren't a thing? That's exactly what Paul Bennewitz was subjected to.
They sent Doty and a physicist. Paul was being occupied with the other guy. Rick was taking pictures of all Bennewitz's equipment in his house.
The more he had contact with me and others within the intelligence community, the more he started analyzing the information. So we kind of planted the seed in Paul that what he was seeing and what he was hearing and what he was collecting was, in fact, probably maybe UFOs. And it was very easy to convince Paul. Paul was a World War II veteran. He's very patriotic. He always flew his flag. Those type of people you can convince that, listen, just telling Paul, you can't tell anybody else about this because this, they could get in the wrong hands. And so immediately Paul became a cooperating source, and he held everything that he had gotten in secrecy.
Doty was feeding this man all kinds of lies about UFOs and aliens being kept underneath a mountain nearby, and so on and so forth. And Bennewitz, of course, was believing all of this.
And Paul's son contacted me and said, leave my father alone. You guys are across the street, and you're bothering my father. He's getting to the point that he's being paranoid. Well, I knew it wasn't us.
He said he saw people coming in and out of the house and looking out from the curtains and things like that. And as it turns out, the NSA had some people in this house. They were watching him and actually beaming messages straight across the street into his antenna setup.
Doty led a direct disinformation campaign in the UFO community through Paul Bennewitz. The NSA actually rented the house across the street from Paul's home in order to provide 24-hour surveillance on him. They were able to shut down the actual breach of security that Paul had made by breaking into his home while he wasn't there and switching his computer with a computer that the NSA would have a direct feed to from across the street. They mimicked the genuine transmissions that he was used to getting, but were also able to drip feed certain words and fabricated messages about ETs that they believed would be picked up on by Paul in his attempts to decode them, and this worked like a charm. Paul remained unaware that his computers were switched and that the transmissions he was receiving now were no longer genuine. He was spending countless hours in front of his computer attempting to translate and decipher the coded and sometimes random transmissions that were being customized and sent to him. When he wasn't trying to decipher coded messages, he was routinely giving progress reports of his investigation at Kirkland Air Force Base to senior officials, all of whom were aware of and acting as a part of Richard Doty's Disinformation Campaign. Richard Doty would often visit Paul at his home, and they would go over various documents that related to the subject of UFOs. They would also routinely be flown out in Air Force helicopters on supposed recon or surveillance missions. Sometimes after the crash of an experimental aircraft, Richard Doty would contact Paul to alert him that there were rumors of a crashed UFO, and then they would both fly out in a helicopter to go take photos of the crash from the air. And also, for a time, as a way to prevent suspicion of a hidden agenda, Richard Doty told Paul that all of this information was top secret and extremely classified. Paul was sworn to secrecy about all of the events taking place and to all the information regarding UFOs or ETs. And like I said before, he was a self-proclaimed patriot and former World War II pilot. He took this very seriously, and while involved in the program, he never said a word to anyone. However, after a while, Richard Doty was able to develop a rapport and even somewhat of a friendship with Paul Bennewitz, and that's when the second phase of the campaign was initiated.
Agents would break into his house to see what he had, and at one point he had these pictures of whatever had crashed up there, and they were very interested in getting these pictures, so they did. From then on, he went up and just took pictures of where it had crashed. What probably crashed there was some sort of unmanned aerial vehicle, and now they're over in the Middle East, remote-controlled, killing people in cars as they drive across the desert. And in 1985, they didn't really want anybody to have any knowledge of this kind of thing. They took great pains to explain to him that it was this atomic-powered aircraft that the aliens helped us with, and, you know, bring down that laughter curtain again so people just wouldn't pay attention. They'd think it was another UFO nut.
Richard Doty told Paul that the government had decided to start disclosing the truth to the American public, and that they couldn't just come out and announce everything all at once, or there'd be a mass panic. So in order to avoid that, they were going to start drip feeding information slowly to the public so that when the truth did finally come out, it wouldn't be nearly as big of a deal. Paul was told that he would have to remain quiet about the majority of things he knew, but that he was now at liberty to discuss certain information about the subject. It was also hinted that as time went on, more and more of the information he knew would become declassified, and that he would act as some sort of unofficial ambassador from the government to the American people regarding the subject of UFOs.
He thought that this was the place where the aliens were getting together to take over the world. And he wanted to trap them all there, kill them all in one fell swoop, and save the Earth. By the mid-'80s, he was getting to the point where he had written all these letters to congressmen, senators, TV stations, even President Reagan saying, this is what's going on, the Air Force is cooperating with me, these are the people who are cooperating with me and giving me this information, Ernest Edwards, Richard Doty, all this. He would put their names in these letters. He'd get answers back saying, we're not interested in the UFO subject. And there was this kind of cognitive dissonance. Here are people in the government telling him, yes, you're right, this stuff is going on, let's keep an eye on it. And then elected officials and other people in the media saying, we don't know what you're talking about, this isn't very important. And nobody seemed to care what he was talking about except the Air Force.
It's not clear to the extent of how far the Air Force was willing to take this, if he was supposed to eventually become some sort of disinformation ambassador. But we'll never know. He started making presentations at UFO conventions with evidence and information that he had collected during his investigation with the Air Force and Richard Doty. Richard Doty would attend these events, lending legitimacy to the information being presented as well as authenticity. Doty found these conventions extremely useful for monitoring the UFO community and as well as identifying individuals who might be useful in future disinformation campaigns. Eventually, Paul started believing that people were breaking into his home while he was there. He reported hearing people in his attic and behind his walls. He also began to believe that aliens were abducting him at night and injecting him with something that caused him to get in his car and drive out to the desert without any memory of ever doing it. And this was about 2 years after the initial start of the campaign. And what's scary is people that knew Paul reported that he really did have injection marks on his arm. And we already know that the NSA had snuck into his home without his knowledge before when they switched the computers. So how much of this was Paul's imagination and how much of it was actually happening to him? The line between the two is sort of blurred because while we almost certainly know that aliens weren't abducting him and injecting him with a memory loss delirium solution, can we say that nobody was? This is what gets me the most about this one. It's such a mindfuck. While the Air Force and Richard Doty deny using any tactics of that nature, others have suggested that the CIA's involvement in this matter is suspiciously absent from record or mentioning of any kind. The most likely answer to that is that they probably were absent. They probably just didn't have anything to do with this particular case. And, that the NSA and the Air Force acted alone. The suspicion is that the CIA was actually conducting a gaslighting campaign in order to drive Paul insane. Whether or not this is true, I highly doubt it. One thing is for certain though, Paul did eventually lose his mind. After a time, even Richard began to worry about Paul's mental state. He decided that Paul was no longer in a state that he felt comfortable conducting this act of deception on. It was determined that due to his deteriorating mental condition, that he was no longer a useful pawn in their campaign. He eventually got so bad that his family became worried and had him committed to an asylum. Once returning home from the asylum, Richard Doty paid him a visit. Richard claimed that he felt guilty over what the NSA and the Air Force had done to Paul and attempted to explain their actions. He came completely clean about everything he had lied about and really tried to pull back the curtain to show Paul that he had been deceived. He tried to show Paul that all of the evidence he possessed was intentionally given to him as a way of covering up classified materials.
Years later, I sat down with Paul at dinner and told Paul exactly that everything we did was a sanctioned counterintelligence operation to convince him that what he was seeing was UFOs, and that what we didn't want him to know was that he tapped into something on the base, and we didn't want him to ever disclose that. Paul looked at me and said, "You don't have to lie to me, Rick. I know it's UFOs related."
Yeah. So that's basically the gist of this film. It's actually narrated by Richard Doty himself, so go check that out if you want. It's a truly crazy story, one that is truly beyond belief. That is, if it's to be believed at all. Because while he was a special agent in the Air Force, a lot of people have pointed out that Richard Doty is a professional liar and that it was literally his job to fool people into believing crazy shit. We know the story of Paul Bennewitz is true. We just don't know if agencies involved are being completely forthcoming about the nature of events that took place. I myself am really unsure about this one. I mean, at one point later on in the documentary, Doty actually claims that the Air Force debriefed him with real evidence of extraterrestrials. I have no idea. This guy's all over the place. So who knows? What do you guys think is going on with this situation? Let me know in the comments. Hope you found this as interesting as me, and thanks for watching. I hope you guys have a great day.